There is no problem human creativity can't solve. Dear ladies and gentlemen, friends of the Schiller Institute, let me greet all of you in person in the conference and online around the world with this optimistic view about the nature of the human species. We are the creative species, the only one known in the universe so far. But the human mind, as the microcosm of the universe at large, the macrocosm, is demonstrably of an anti-entropic nature. Our creative reason is capable of always finding a solution to any problem on a higher plane, and that is why I'm certain that by mobilizing the best potential of mankind in its entirety, that we will be able to reach a new paradigm in our international relations that will catapult us to a new era in the history of mankind. We will be able to create a world community which will be worthy of the dignity of man and the potential beauty of his soul. One has to say absolutely no to any practical approach to politics and start from that vision. It is obviously true that the present world is in a state of almost complete disarray. We have already come very far in the regression of barbarism by tolerating in Gaza what has been termed even by former Prime Minister Olmert close to war crimes, and an ongoing genocide since long by the International Court of Justice and lately even by Joseph Borrell. A toleration which has put a horrible stain on all of humanity and which could lead in the short term to an all-out war in Southwest Asia, which could escalate into a global nuclear war. The recent developments around Ukraine, the war there, have revealed an amazing lineup. The two largest nuclear powers, the presidents of the United States and Russia, are attempting to find a peace agreement to end the war, about which every sane person should be happy. While some Europeans, the so-called coalition of the willing, are trying to sabotage these efforts to prolong the war and have not given up on the goal to enable Ukraine to, quote, win the war, even at a moment when the Ukrainian army and the population cannot sustain this war of attrition any longer, with more than 1 million people dead. Reliable military experts are warning that the military capabilities of the countries of the coalition of the willing are a far cry from being able to confront Russia without US backing. And the European economies are collapsing as a result of a self-inflicted crisis, exorbitant energy prices and green ideology. Everything that was built up in Germany out of the rubble fields from the end of the Second World War is now being dismantled. Journalists and analysts around the world are asking with disbelief, what is going on with Germany and Europe in general? Why are they ruining themselves? They let their Nord Stream pipelines be blown up. They impose sanctions on Russia, which is making the Russian economy grow and ruining their own economy. Germany closes its nuclear plants without having alternative energy sources, and only 80 years after World War II, Germany is militarizing its economy again with a form of credit creation which echoes the MEFO bills of Hjalmar Schacht, just to put the German army close to the Russian border and to send German tanks against Russia again? 20, 30 years ago, Europe was seen as the best model in the world, with a top ratio of scientific and technological innovation and a resulting competitive economy, a high quality of life, high social standards, safe living conditions. And now, Europe is about to be completely sidelined. They can't repair their infrastructure. The trains are never on time. They let their hidden champions, the middle-level industries, go bankrupt or invest abroad. Their social system is cut to pieces. There is no easy answer because it is a layered, multifaceted problem with many levels of what can be rightly called brainwashing or nudging, as it is called nowadays. One set of layers starts with the geopolitical maneuvers, just as what was rightly termed the historic chance of German unification was sabotaged through the geopolitical maneuvers of the neocons in the Anglosphere, who from the beginning had no intention of making good on the promises given to Gorbachev and the Soviet leadership at the end of the Cold War. Namely, that NATO would not move 1 inch to the east if Germany was allowed to unify and even join NATO. The neocons were exuberant in their triumphalism that they had, quote, won the Cold War, arrogantly ignoring the warnings of Pope John Paul II, who said that the structures of sin existed equally in the East and the West, and that one only had to look at the underdevelopment of the so-called Third World as a result of the continuation of neocolonialism to find the proof that the structures of sin also existed in the West. But they proceeded with the Wolfowitz doctrine, the outline for the unipolar world, and imagined that this would be the end of history, probably the shortest lived 1,000-year fantasy ever. I warned at the time that if the financial powers used the bankruptcy of the Comic-Con to completely superimpose the equally bankrupt neoliberal system in the world, that while they may postpone a collapse, it surely would arrive with a vengeance on a much larger scale than even the collapse of the Soviet Union. There are dozens and dozens of documents recently released in US, German, British, and French archives and libraries about the countless security insurances against an eastward expansion of NATO given to Gorbachev and Shevardnadze by Baker, Bush Sr., Genscher, Kohl, Gates, Mitterrand, Thatcher, Hurd, Major, and Werner. They also reveal that a membership in NATO for the Central and Eastern European states was rejected by many leading politicians. The basic keynote speech by Foreign Minister Genscher in the Protestant Academy of Tutzing of January 31st, 1990, the so-called Tutzing formula, influenced a whole series of top meetings in the following days, in which Gorbachev agreed to German unification, provided that NATO would not be extended to the east. Genscher stated, "We don't want unity at the expense of third parties. It is up to NATO to declare unmistakably, whatever happens in the Warsaw Pact, an extension of NATO territory to the east that is closer to the borders of the Soviet Union will not happen." This speech has disappeared from the internet and can only be found if you really look in the internet with a research function which is not easily accessible. In a memorandum of February 9th about the discussion between US Secretary of State James Baker and Eduard Shevardnadze, Baker is quoted clearly, "There would, of course, have to be an ironclad guarantee that NATO's jurisdiction or forces would not move eastward." The chances to establish a new international peace order, or a common European house, as Gorbachev called it, for which Lyndon LaRouche had proposed the economic basis, first with the program called the Productive Triangle, Paris, Berlin, Vienna, and then after the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the Eurasian land bridge. These chances were missed. This was the original sin of the post-Cold War order, and George Kennan, more than any other, the father of the containment policy, criticized the eastward expansion of NATO sharply in an interview with the New York Times on February 5th, 1997, calling it a tragic mistake for which there is no reason for whatsoever. If one considers the fact that at the moment and it was only 45 years after World War II, in which the Soviet Union had lost 27 million citizens in a war against the National Socialists. Please show the video. This is the introduction of a 7-part propaganda films which were produced by the US Department of War from 1942 to 1945 during World War II. It was originally written for American soldiers to help them understand why the United States was involved in the war, but US President Roosevelt ordered the distribution for public viewing. And I would urge you to watch the entire, without any doubt, shows the appreciation of the United States for the vast superior contribution of the Soviet army in defeating and fighting against the National Socialists. And I think it's necessary to remind people of that, given the revisionist efforts to try to rewrite the history of the Second World War and many things beyond that. Now, the Russians demonstrated, in light of these incredible losses of World War II, an enormous generosity in allowing German unification, and even agreeing that the unified Germany would be part of NATO. In light of all of these promises, the breach in trust was felt all the deeper. If one then considers that there was also a unilateral cancellation of all arms control agreements by the West, from the ABM, the INF, the Open Sky Treaty, the KSE treaties, and then the admission by Merkel and Hollande that they had only agreed to the Minsk II treaty to gain time for Ukraine to be trained up to a NATO level, one can see clearly that the obligation to fulfill is on the side of the West. One must add the New York Times article of March 29 of this year, based on 300 interviews as part of a 1-year-long investigation, which revealed that the US headquarters of the US Army in Wiesbaden was from spring 22 onward the command center for the war in Ukraine, at a point when Boris Johnson flew to Kiev to sabotage the so-called Istanbul agreement between Putin and Zelensky, giving this way the ultimate proof that this war was not about Ukraine, but it was a proxy war between the United States and NATO on the one side and Russia on the other. It is time now for a sober assessment of these 35 years which have passed, if we want to find a way out. We clearly remember that at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, the mantra from the West, from Biden, Scholz, Macron, von der Leyen, was Ukraine must win, Russia must be ruined, Baerbock. Now, a bit more than 3 years later, it is evident that Ukraine, and therefore NATO, has lost the war. And that loss is just one in a row of many others. Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya. Should one add Syria with a now reformed Al-Qaeda leader as president? And that despite more than 800 military bases in the United States in order to prop up their unipolar order and its dominant position in the world. President Trump won the election a second time because he promised to end these wars and not to start new ones. There must be a realization that the model of propping up the unipolar world through a system of over 800 bases has utterly failed. So why is the European coalition of the willing then sticking to a failed policy? It is obvious that they don't feel that they are in a community of values with the United States as a nation, but with a neoliberal system, actually not the America as a republic, but with an America subverted by the British Empire based on the Anglo-American special relationship. And with Trump having left that relationship, what remains is loyalty to the British Empire. And that system turns out not to be liberal at all. When Vice President J.D. Vance blamed the Europeans at the Munich Security Conference of having a degenerated sense of democracy, and that in the EU, many notions were used that reminded him of the Soviet Union, such as disinformation to discredit alternative opinions, the outcry was deafening. But the case of Romania demonstrates that the EU lets countries vote as often as it is necessary to get the desired result. There are more and more laws in the EU and on national levels that criminalize so-called disinformation, which has led many people to believe that in Europe as well, a deep state is active, which goes after any opinion deviating from the official NATO narrative. The recent case of depriving two German journalists, Thomas Röper and Alina Lipp, who are working in Russia, de facto of their citizenship, has been compared to the Edict of Worms of 1521 and the proscription of Martin Luther, who was equally deprived of all rights of citizenship. Libraries in Germany now categorize books with a marker showing what the philosophical and political outlook of the author is, as if the library users were too stupid to judge it for themselves, indicating to them what is politically correct. And most worrisome of all is the bellicose, Russophobic outlook of the new Chancellor Friedrich Merz and his efforts to completely militarize the German economy, which has already evoked the old fear of German militarism among European neighbors. But there is also a completely different reality of the countries of the global south, who by far are now the global majority of mankind. Not only have they refused to accept the NATO narrative about the reasons for the Ukraine war, but they are inspired by the largest economic miracle in history, the one China has accomplished in the last 40 years, lifting 850 million people of its own citizens out of poverty and providing with the Belt and Road Initiative a transmission belt to bring the accomplishments of China to the countries of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. According to the Critical Technology Tracker, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, ESPI, China is now leading in 57 of 64 advanced technologies. There are literally hundreds of Chinese cities with several million inhabitants each, with enormous modern construction connected through a system of more than 42,000 kilometer fast train connections, figure of 24. A system larger than that of all other countries combined. And these trains are on time. It would require a whole presentation in itself to do justice to the breathtaking success of the Chinese model of economy. If the US and EU declare China to be a systemic rival, the collective West has lost that race already. But rather than studying the reasons for that success of the Chinese economic model, which is based on a continuous injection of innovation into the economy, and which is a Chinese version of the American system of economy developed by Alexander Hamilton, both the US and the EU so far seem determined to engage in a new arms race on land, air, sea, and space. At the very latest, since the historic memorandum between President Xi and Putin on the 4th of February 22, which consolidated a strategic partnership without limitations. This strategic relationship between the strongest economy in the world and the technologically most advanced nuclear superpower, with China catching up fast in that area as well, should have made clear to any strategist of any country that the shift to a multipolar world has been consolidated. Another powerful demonstration of that partnership was the joint participation of Xi and Putin at the military parade in Moscow on May 9th, celebrating the 80th anniversary of National Socialism in Moscow. Please show the two pictures. The world community is now faced with essentially only two choices. Either we continue with geopolitical confrontation, risking a nuclear war globally in the end, which would end civilization, or we can mobilize the wisdom of the conveners of the Peace of Westphalia, who recognized that after 150 years of religious war in Europe, that there would be no winner, since a continuation of the war would leave everybody dead. In the first case, we could see an unprecedented arms race, including the so-called Golden Dome missile defense system envisioned by President Trump, which is to be ready in 3 years, which is a global, multi-level, multi-domain missile defense system that seeks a significant expansion of outer space-based combat capabilities, including the development and deployment of orbital interception systems. It violates the principle of outer space treaty for the peaceful use of space, yet another arms control treaty which is thrown into the waste paper basket. It will for sure be answered by Russia and China and all other major players. In that geometry, Europe will likewise go into a complete militarization, try to build a European nuclear shield. Germany will try to build up the strongest army in Europe. Enormous physical capabilities will be wasted, while the real economy and the social system get wiped out. Likely, none of these plans will come to fruition, because in the meantime, the completely overextended financial system will blow out, the US debt crisis will detonate, NATO and the EU will disintegrate, all of Europe will experience an explosion of civil unrest. If Germany does not before become a theater of war, in case Merz goes ahead secretly and deploys the Taurus, and soon the new German-British long-range missile with a range of 2,000 kilometers to Ukraine and other countries. Europe will soon be only shown as a fossil of a civilization that did not make it in museums around the world. Either way, there will be no good outcome. We suggest a completely different approach, and this is what this conference is all about. We recognize that we have reached a point in universal history where we need a paradigm shift, more fundamental than the change of axioms from the Middle Ages in Europe to the modern age, which replaced the image of man and conception of the physical universe from a dark age of superstition to the modern idea of the role of science and technology and the perfectibility of the human individual. Today, we have to leave geopolitical ambitions behind and proceed from the notion of the one humanity first, and then put all national interest in cohesion with that superseding concept. We have to apply the idea of Nicolaus of Cusa, that harmony in the macrocosm is only possible if all microcosms develop in the best possible way, and if each microcosm or nation regards it as its fundamental interest, the development of all other microcosms and nations, and vice versa. It is no coincidence that the Confucian idea of the harmonious development of all members of a family, a nation, or the community of nations is essentially the same idea as that of Nicolaus of Cusa, which happens to underlie Xi Jinping's concept of the shared future of humanity and his three principles: the Global Security Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, and the Global Civilizational Initiative. We have to undo the original sin of the eastward expansion of NATO and replace it with a concept of indivisible security, a system which takes into account the security interest of every single country on the planet. Let us mobilize, therefore, and issue a passionate appeal for the peaceful transformation to a new epoch in human history, where we look at our human species from the vantage point of 100 years from now, when we will have stopped being a bunch of squabbling toddlers kicking each other in the shin bone, when we will be grown up as humanity, where thermonuclear fusion energy will be commercially available to all nations, so no more wars over energy resources. Pyrolysis, chemical recycling, biotechnological methods, gasification, plasma arc processes, or in the future, the fusion torch process will give us access to limitless raw materials, so no more wars over the control of them. We will have built infrastructure in nearby space, villages on the moon and cities on Mars, and will have made the improvement in our identity as one human family, which the German-American space pioneer Kraft Ericke foresaw with his extraterrestrial imperative. AI and technologies we have not even asked the right scientific question about will free us from the burden of repetitive labor, giving each child the preconditions for lifelong learning, fulfilling the ideal of Confucius and Wilhelm von Humboldt of a perfectly harmoniously developed character, or as Friedrich Schiller called it, a beautiful soul and a genius. Let us therefore initiate a process of dialogues where we put the idea of a new international security and development on the agenda in the tradition of the Peace of Westphalia, where we agree on the UN Charter as a starting point of international law, and then on principles first as to how approach the particular challenges, problems, and tasks, and then leave it to the well-meaning negotiators to work out all the disputes concretely. We have the plans already to overcome poverty and underdevelopment with the program of the World Land Bridge. We have the OASIS plan to transform Southwest Asia, turning the deserts into lush fields, forests, and orchids. We have the economic blueprints to create 3 billion new productive jobs in Africa, Asia, and Latin America to overcome the migrant crisis through economic development. Let the Americans go back to the beautiful vision of the international project to create a new republic on the American shores, what you saw Lyndon LaRouche speaking about in the short video clip at the beginning. A project, the first of that kind, to establish a republic devoted to the common good, not only of the present, but of all future generations, as it is stated in the preamble of the Constitution. A republic which was the absolute countermodel to all forms of oligarchy, imperialism, and tyranny, and which fought the first anti-colonial war against the British Empire to accomplish that. Let America turn to the foreign policy approach of John Quincy Adams from 1821 and turn America into a champion of liberty again and not engage in foreign wars to promote democracy abroad. John Quincy Adams said, "America does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all. She is the champion and vindicator only of her own. Let the Europeans renounce all forms of neocolonialism and arrogance that treats the rest of the world as a jungle. Let us revive the lofty outlook of the great Renaissances and classical periods in which the noble character of man was celebrated in philosophy, poetry, painting, sculpture, and musical compositions, which enriched universal history forever. Let's replace geopolitical confrontation with cooperation, especially with the countries of the global majority, and all problems can be solved easily. We must immediately take very concrete steps in the UN General Assembly, the BRICS, or any other suitable forum to put the new international security and development architecture on the table and agree to projects which coincide with the common aims of mankind. All we need to accomplish that is to become truly human ourselves and call forth an almost tender love for humanity.